On June 2, 1948, in the courtyard of Landsberg Prison in Bavaria, 7 men were hanged for crimes committed not with rifles, but with scalpels and syringes. Among them was Karl Brandt, the man who ran the Nazi euthanasia program. They were Nazi doctors, condemned at Nuremberg for experiments so monstrous that even prosecutors struggled to find words for them. Justice, it seemed, had been done. But here is the truth almost no one tells you. Those 7 men were the exception, not the rule. At least 350 German doctors directly participated in the machinery of murder, the experiments, the sterilizations, the killing of the sick and the disabled. Only 23 ever stood trial. And the single most notorious of them all, the man who selected victims on the ramp at Auschwitz with a flick of his thumb, Josef Mengele, was nowhere near that courtroom. He was already gone, and he would die an old man, free, in a foreign country, decades later. This is the story of the Nazi doctors who escaped justice, and what really happened after Nuremberg, the trial that was supposed to set the standard. On December 9, 1946, in the same palace of justice at Nuremberg where the Nazi leadership had already been judged, a new trial began, one that would confront a different kind of evil. Not the generals, not the politicians, the doctors. It was officially called United States of America v. Karl Brandt and others, but the world came to know it simply as the doctors' trial. In the dock sat 23 defendants, 20 of them physicians, men who had sworn an oath to heal and had instead turned the human body into a laboratory of suffering. The chief judge was Harold Sebring of Florida. He would later say that trying only 23 doctors felt like a drop in the bucket, but in that moment, no one knew how vast the bucket truly was. Over 8 months, the court heard testimony about experiments on conscious, non-consenting prisoners who were treated as raw material, a proceeding that strained the limits of the legal system itself. Consider just one example, because it captures the cold logic of the whole enterprise. At Dachau, in service of the German Air Force, doctors wanted to know how long a downed pilot might survive in the ocean. So they took prisoners and forced them to drink nothing but seawater for days. They tested methods to make it drinkable. And when those methods failed, they recorded the slow, agonizing deaths as control data. This was not rage, it was research. And that is what made it so chilling. The evidence was overwhelming. One survivor, Jadwiga Jiddo, stood in that courtroom and rolled up her sleeve to show the judges the SS-run scar that ran from her wrist to her oboe, a permanent signature of Nazi medicine. The documents, the photographs, the meticulous German records condemned the defendants in their own handwriting. On August 20, 1947, the verdicts came down. 16 of the 23 were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death. And in the early hours of June 2, 1948, those 7, including Karl Brandt, Hitler's escort physician, and the man who ran the Nazi euthanasia program, were hanged at Landsberg Prison. 23 men in a dock could not answer for what an entire profession had done, yet from that courtroom came a framework meant to ensure it could never happen again. In August 1947, the judges issued the Nuremberg Code, a foundational ethical principle that no human may be experimented upon without voluntary, informed consent. It was medicine's solemn promise, never again. The Nuremberg Code was largely ignored, even by its own architects. The American doctor who led the prosecution later defended unethical experiments on disabled children, and for decades, the U.S. South and other allied nations continued dubious research on the poor, imprisoned, and vulnerable. The code was rarely cited in American medical ethics until the 1980s. The principle had been written in the blood of Nazi victims, and then, for a generation, quietly shelved. The trial was supposed to set the standard. Instead, it became a monument that the world admired and then walked past. And while it stood there, gleaming and incomplete, the men it had failed to catch were already disappearing. The ones who were never in the room. To understand the true scandal of the doctor's trial, you have to look not at the 23 men who stood in that dock, but at the thousands who never did. The German medical profession was not a reluctant bystander to the Nazi project. It was one of its most enthusiastic participants. Consider the single most damning statistic of all. Roughly 45% of German physicians joined the Nazi Party, the highest membership rate of any profession in the entire country. Doctors enrolled in the SS at rates far above teachers, lawyers, or engineers. The men who were supposed to embody care and mercy proved to be among the regime's most willing servants, and their crimes were not the work of a few isolated monsters. They were industrial in scale, and they were organized. At least 200 doctors participated in Action T4, systematic murder of the disabled, over 404 sterilizations, 200 in concentration camp selections and experiments, and 100 more in research institutes. Yet only a handful ever faced trial, a pyramid of complicity with almost no accountability at the top. Added together, and you are looking not 23 guilty men, but at well over 1,000, at least 3,500 German doctors served in the SS, and more than 1,500 of them worked directly in camps, ghettos, or euthanasia centers. 23 stood trial. The rest, overwhelmingly, did not. So where did they go? Some simply melted back into ordinary German life, and we will return to them, because they are the largest group of all. But the most wanted, the ones who feared the noose, needed to vanish entirely, and for them, an escape network was waiting. History remembers these routes by a single, sinister name, the ratlines, a term coined by American intelligence officers who saw the fugitives scattering like rats from a sinking ship. Fugitives slipped south through South Tyrol, obtained false papers in Rome, and sailed from Genoa to Argentina, where President Perón openly welcomed German technicians. This conveyor belt for the guilty ran for years. Escape lines operated with institutional help. Bishop Alois Hudel used his Vatican position to provide documents and shelter. The Red Cross issued travel papers to false identities, and the SS network Odessa ran safe houses and ship bookings. This conveyor belt carried hundreds of fugitives to South America, with the quiet cooperation of respected institutions. Working alongside the remnants of this underground SS support network, men like Hudel helped some of the worst offenders of the 20th century reach safety and anonymity. By 1949, American intelligence stopped hunting Nazi doctors as the Cold War pivoted attention from defeated Germany to the Soviet Union. A German doctor's expertise became an asset, not evidence of crime, and the hunters became recruiters, granting former war criminals a second life, not in hiding, but in plain sight. The angel of death who vanished. Of all the doctors who escaped justice, one name towers above the rest, a man whose very title tells you everything. They called him the angel of death. His name was Josef Mengele. At Auschwitz, 1943, Mengele stood on the railway ramp, and with a casual flick of his hand, left or right, decided who would live and who would go to the gas chambers. A gesture, a glance, life or death dispensed like sorting cords. Mengele collected twins from the transports, subjecting them to experiments, injecting dyes into eyes, infecting one to study disease progression, then killing both to compare organs on a dissection table. He pursued this with scientific enthusiasm and no conscience. One survivor recalled him casually remarking that a pair he'd just killed couldn't be properly examined because he'd ruined the internal organs. And when the war collapsed, this man, perhaps the single most wanted criminal of the age, simply walked away. In January 1945, as the Red Army approached Auschwitz, Mengele fled with a medical unit, moving westward through Czechoslovakia and into Germany. Astonishingly, he was captured by American forces in the chaos of the defeated Reich, but he was registered under a false name. His face was not yet on the wanted lists. He had his SS blood-type tattoo removed to avoid detection. Within weeks, he was released. For nearly 4 years, he hid in plain sight, working as a farmhand in rural Bavaria, milking cows under a false name while the world searched for him. Then, in 1949, he took the rat line, south through Italy, false papers, a ship from Genoa, and across the Atlantic to Argentina, exactly the route that carried so many others to safety. For a decade, he lived in Buenos Aires under variations of his real name, even resuming contact with his family back home. Mossad and Simon Wiesenthal hunted Mengele for years, but he always stayed ahead, fleeing to Paraguay in 1959 under President Stroessner's protection, then into Brazil with a network of sympathizers. He grew old in the shadows, moving between farms and safe houses, never captured. In 1977, his son Rolf traveled to Brazil to see the father he barely knew. He found a bitter, unrepentant old man. By Rolf's own later account, Josef Mengele expressed no remorse whatsoever, no regret for Auschwitz, no acknowledgement of the children, no flicker of conscience. He defended what he had done to the very end. What? In letters to his family, intercepted years later, Mengele complained bitterly about being persecuted, as though Auschwitz had been a misunderstanding. That end came on February 7th, 1979. Swimming in the ocean off the resort town of Bertioga, Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He was buried under a false name, Wolfgang Gerhard, and for 6 more years, the world did not know the most hunted man on earth was already dead. The truth surfaced in 1985, when investigators traced his hiding network and exhumed the grave. Forensic experts used facial reconstruction techniques, laying the skull against photographs, to build their case. But the identification was contested. It was only in 1992, when DNA from a femur fragment was matched to Mengele's surviving relatives, that the confirmation became beyond doubt. The remains were Mengele's. He had never been caught. He had never stood trial. He had never answered for a single child. The angel of death had died free, an old man in warm water, far from the ramp at Auschwitz. His body was exhumed, identified, and for a time, kept in a Brazilian medical school as a specimen. The irony was not lost on anyone. Dr. Death in Cairo, and the doctors America hired and Germany rehired. Mengele's escape was the most famous, but it was only one face of a much larger failure. Because the doctors who got away did so in 3 very different ways, and each one is more disturbing than the last. The first face is the one most like Mengele, the fugitive who simply vanished. His name was Arabir Hein, and at the Mauthausen concentration camp, his fellow prisoners gave him a nickname that matched Mengele's own, Dr. Death. Heim's cruelty was almost theatrical in its evil. He was accused of operating on healthy prisoners without anesthesia, of injecting poisons directly into victims' hearts to time how long they took to die, of murdering for the sheer clinical curiosity of it. And when the war ended, Heim slipped through the cracks. He was held briefly, released, and even practiced medicine in Germany for years before the net began to close in the early 1960s. So he ran. And where he ran is the remarkable part. Aribert Heim made his way to Cairo, Egypt, converted to Islam, and reinvented himself entirely as a man named Tariq Hussein Farid. He lived there quietly for decades, hidden in plain sight in a foreign city, beyond the reach of every investigator hunting him. He died of cancer in 1992, and the world did not learn his fate until 2009, when journalists finally pieced together the trail. One of the most wanted war criminals in history had lived out his life as an ordinary Cairo resident, undisturbed. The second face is darker still, because it was not escape, it was recruitment. His name was Kurt Blome, and he was one of the architects of Nazi biological warfare. Blome worked on weaponizing some of the deadliest pathogens known to man: plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid. In October 1944, Heinrich Himmler personally ordered him to test plague on concentration camp prisoners. By any honest measure, Blome belonged on the gallows beside Karl Brandt. Dr. Kurt Blome was acquitted at the doctor's trial in 1947, widely believed to be due to American intervention, because the U.S. South wanted his knowledge. In 1951, the Army hired him to work on chemical and biological weapons under Operation Paperclip, giving a salary to the man who had tested plague on prisoners. But the third phase is the most important of all, because it is the largest, and the one history most often forgets. These were the doctors who never fled anywhere, who never needed a ratline or a false name, because no one ever came for them. They simply went back to work. Tie line or a false name, because no one ever came for them. They simply went back to work. Consider Herta Oberhuser, the only woman convicted at a doctor's trial. At the Ravensbrück women's camp, she had carried out horrific experiments, deliberately infecting wounds, killing prisoners with injections. She was sentenced to 20 years, but her sentence was commuted to 10, and she was released in April 1952, after serving only 5. And then, astonishingly, she opened a medical practice. Herta Oberhuser became a respected family doctor in the quiet German village of Stocksee, treating patients, delivering care, living a normal life, until 1956, when a Ravensbrück survivor recognized her former tormentor. Only then was her license finally revoked. In 1958. She was not an aberration. Across post-war Germany, this was the pattern. Convicted and uncharged doctors alike, quietly returning to the profession. Oberhuser was not the exception. She was the rule. The reckoning that mostly wasn't? So let us do the arithmetic of justice. Let us actually count. 7 Nazi doctors were hanged at Landsberg Prison on June 2, 1948. Across all of the Nazi medical proceedings combined, every trial, in every zone, only a few dozen physicians were ever convicted of anything at all. And against that handful stands the other number, the one that should never be forgotten. The thousands of German doctors with Nazi pasts who, after the war, simply resumed their careers. They became respected physicians, department heads, university professors. Some trained the next generation of German medicine, their wartime records buried beneath new titles and quiet respectability. A handful hanged, thousands walked free. That is the true ledger of Nuremberg, and it does not balance. Why did it happen this way? There was no single cause. There were many, and together they were overwhelming. There was the Cold War, which transformed Nazi expertise from a crime into a commodity, sending men like Kurt Blome into American laboratories instead of onto the gallows. There were the ratlines, carrying the most wanted to Argentina and Cairo and beyond. There was the sheer paralyzing scale of the guilt. When nearly half a profession is complicit, who exactly do you arrest? There was public exhaustion, a war-weary world that wanted to rebuild and forget rather than prosecute for another decade. And there was something quieter and more corrosive, a profession that protected its own. Doctors vouched for doctors. Colleagues looked away. The medical establishment closed ranks around men it should have expelled, and in doing so, it chose comfort over conscience. That silence lasted an astonishingly long time. The German medical profession, the institution whose members had joined the Nazi Party in greater numbers than any other, did not formally and fully reckon with its own role in the regime's crimes for decades. It was not until the Nuremberg Declaration of 2012, 65 years after the trial, that the German Medical Assembly issued a clear acknowledgement of the profession's active participation in Nazi atrocities and an apology to the victims. 2 generations of victims had already died waiting for those words, and so we are left with an image, 2 images really, side by side. Picture the courtroom at Nuremberg, the empty dock, the 7 who hanged, the code written in the blood of the murdered, promising the world it would never happen again, a monument to justice, gleaming and incomplete. Now pull away from that courtroom, across an ocean and across the years, to a faded photograph taken in Brazil, an old man, relaxed in the sun, smiling at the camera. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, who selected children for the gas with a wave of his hand, and who died free and unrepentant on a warm beach, an ocean away from any consequence. Hold those 2 pictures together, because the distance between them is the whole story. That distance is everything the world meant to do and everything it failed to do. The trials were real. The Nuremberg Code was real. The 7 who hanged answered at last for their crimes. But they were the exception in a sea of escape, a brief, bright flash of accountability in a long darkness of men who got away. The reckoning that the victims deserved, the full and final accounting for what an entire profession had done, that reckoning mostly never came. It died on ratlines and in laboratories and in quiet village practices, in all the places the guilty were allowed to grow old. The scalpels were put away, but the hands that held them were not.